I stood in the courthouse corridor, my hands trembling, as I watched my father Frank laugh with Judge Harrison through the frosted glass doors. This was supposed to be simple. Just a formal reading of my grandfather's will, confirming what we all knew: I was inheriting his $2 million estate. But Frank had contested it, claiming I was mentally incompetent to handle such wealth. The worst part, Judge Harrison happened to be my father's old college roommate from their fraternity days at State University. As I pushed open those heavy oak doors and stepped into the courtroom, Frank pointed his finger directly at me with pure disgust etched across his weathered face. His voice boomed through the silent room as he told Judge Harrison, "This man only knows how to waste what he doesn't deserve." The judge nodded approvingly, while Frank's attorney flashed a confident grin. "My name is Cooper, and I need to take you back to understand how I ended up in this nightmare. My grandfather William was everything my father wasn't: reliable, hardworking, and genuinely caring. William had built Patterson Construction from nothing, starting with a single pickup truck and a toolbox in 1972. By the time I was born, he owned the largest construction company in 3 counties with over 200 employees and contracts across the entire state. My mother, Sarah, died in a car accident when I was 12 years old. The drunk driver who hit her walked away without a scratch while she bled out on Highway 67. Frank completely fell apart after that, turning to alcohol and blaming everyone except himself. He'd disappear for weeks at a time, leaving me alone in our empty house with nothing but cereal boxes and frozen dinners. That's when Grandpa William stepped in. William became my guardian, my mentor, my father figure. He taught me about honest work, treating employees with respect, and building something that would last beyond your own lifetime. Every summer, I worked construction sites alongside seasoned crews, learning the business from the ground up. William never handed me anything. I earned every dollar, every lesson, every moment of his respect. Frank, meanwhile, drifted further away from our family. He moved to California in 2018, claiming he had business opportunities waiting for him. The truth was, he couldn't stand watching William and me grow closer. Frank always resented that his own father preferred spending time with his grandson instead of his biological son. When William passed away 3 months ago from complications related to pneumonia, the funeral revealed just how far Frank had fallen. He showed up 30 minutes late, reeking of whiskey, and stumbling through the cemetery. During the service, he interrupted the pastor twice, demanding to know when the will would be read. Several mourners shook their heads in disgust as Frank made crude comments about finally getting his fair share of the family money. Mrs. Patterson, William's longtime attorney, gathered us in her office the following Tuesday. The will was straightforward. Everything went to me, except for a monthly allowance of $2,000 for Frank. This included the construction business, 3 rental properties, William's personal residence, and approximately $1.7 million in various investments and savings accounts. Frank's reaction was immediate and explosive. He slammed his fist on Mrs. Patterson's mahogany desk, sending her coffee mug crashing to the floor. "This is absolute garbage," he screamed. "I'm his blood son Cooper's just some spoiled kid who never worked a real day in his life." Mrs. Patterson calmly informed him that William had been very specific about his wishes and that the will was legally binding. That's when Frank threatened legal action. He stormed out of the office, shouting that he'd prove I was incompetent to handle such responsibility. I thought it was just empty anger, the rantings of a desperate man who'd wasted his life on poor choices and alcohol. I was completely wrong. Now, sitting in this courtroom, I watched Frank's lawyer present what seemed like an overwhelming case against me. Attorney Marcus Webb stood before Judge Harrison with a thick folder of documents, photographs, and witness statements. Each piece of evidence painted me as a reckless, irresponsible young man who squandered money on parties, gambling, and expensive toys. Webb displayed enlarged photographs showing me at various social gatherings, always with a drink in my hand. He produced receipts allegedly showing I'd purchased a $15,000 motorcycle, a $5,000 gaming setup, and spent over $3,000 at Atlantic City casinos. Multiple witnesses had signed statements claiming they'd seen me drunk and disorderly at public events, including one incident where I supposedly threatened a security guard at a nightclub. The evidence was devastating and completely fabricated. I recognized some of the photographs. They were real pictures of me at birthday parties and work celebrations, but someone had digitally altered them to make drinks appear larger and more frequent. The receipts were cleverly forged documents using my name and signature. The witness statements came from people I'd never met in my entire life. During a brief recess, I approached my court-appointed attorney, Dave Martinez. He was a young public defender who looked overwhelmed and unprepared. "Dave, this is all fake," I whispered urgently. "Those receipts, those witnesses, none of this actually happened." Dave shrugged helplessly. "Cooper, I believe you, but proving fraud is extremely difficult. Your father's attorney has done his homework. Without concrete evidence that these documents are forgeries, the judge has to consider them legitimate." As court resumed, I watched Frank take the witness stand. He spoke with practiced sincerity about his deep concern for my well-being and his responsibility as a father to protect the family legacy. Judge Harrison listened attentively, occasionally nodding with sympathy as Frank described his heartbreak over my alleged destructive behavior. "Your Honor," Frank said, dabbing his eyes with a tissue, "my father worked his entire life to build something meaningful. He would be devastated to see everything he accomplished destroyed by gambling debts and reckless spending. I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this to honor his memory." The performance was sickening and completely convincing. During another recess, I overheard Frank whispering with Webb near the water fountain. "Everything's going perfectly," Frank said. "Harrison owes me big time, and these documents look completely legitimate. That private investigator you recommended did excellent work." My blood ran cold. Frank had hired a private investigator specifically to manufacture evidence against me. This wasn't just a desperate father trying to claim inheritance. This was an elaborate fraud designed to steal everything my grandfather had worked for. The corruption ran deeper than I'd imagined, and I realized I was completely outmatched in this rigged system. Over the following weeks, leading up to this trial, I'd experienced a series of devastating setbacks that now made perfect sense. When I first received notice of Frank's legal challenge, I immediately sought representation from Sullivan and Associates, one of the most respected law firms in the city. After an initial consultation, attorney Jennifer Sullivan seemed confident about defending William's will. 3 days later, her office called to inform me they were withdrawing from my case due to scheduling conflicts. The same thing happened with Morrison Legal Group and Bradley and Partners. Each firm initially showed interest, then mysteriously backed out within a week of our first meeting. I later discovered Frank had contacted each firm personally, spinning elaborate stories about my history of violence and threats against legal professionals. He'd convinced them I was dangerous and unstable, making them too nervous to take my case. By the time I realized what was happening, every reputable attorney in the area had already formed negative opinions about me, based on Frank's lies. That left me with Dave Martinez, a well-meaning public defender who was juggling 43 other cases simultaneously. Dave barely had time to review the basic facts before we entered court, let alone investigate the suspicious evidence Frank's team had assembled. During Frank's testimony, he painted himself as a long-suffering father dealing with a troubled son. He claimed I'd been struggling with substance abuse since college, frequently calling him for money to cover gambling debts and drug purchases. According to Frank, William had been too emotionally attached to see my problems clearly. My father loved Cooper deeply. Frank testified, his voice cracking with false emotion. But love can blind us to harsh realities. I tried multiple times to discuss Cooper's issues with Dad, but he always defended him. Now I see that I should have been more forceful in protecting my father from being taken advantage of. Judge Harrison offered Frank tissues and a glass of water, treating him like a grieving victim rather than a manipulative liar. The judge's sympathetic responses felt rehearsed, as if he'd already decided the case outcome before hearing any evidence. I attempted to present character witnesses who could testify about my actual behavior and work ethic. Robert Chen Williams' business partner for over 20 years had driven 4 hours to speak on my behalf. Professor Angela Davis from my college had prepared a detailed statement about my academic performance and leadership roles. My current supervisor at Riverside Community Foundation, where I worked as a program coordinator, had documented my 3 years of reliable service and community impact. Judge Harrison systematically excluded every single witness I'd arranged. Robert Chen's testimony was ruled irrelevant because it focused on my grandfather's opinions rather than objective facts about my character. Professor Davis's statement was dismissed as hearsay since she couldn't speak to my current behavior years after graduation. My supervisor's testimony was rejected because it allegedly contained speculation about my future reliability rather than concrete evidence. The pattern became obvious. Harrison was using legal technicalities to prevent anyone from contradicting Frank's narrative. Every piece of evidence supporting my character was excluded, while every suspicious document Frank presented was accepted without scrutiny. During a bathroom break, I stepped into the men's room and heard familiar voices from one of the stalls. Frank and Judge Harrison were having a private conversation, apparently unaware that sound carried clearly through the thin walls. "This inheritance case couldn't have come at a better time," Harrison said. "My son's medical bills are destroying us financially. The experimental treatment isn't covered by insurance, and we're looking at another $100,000 minimum." Frank's voice was confident and reassuring. "Don't worry about it, Harrison. Once this is settled, I'll have plenty of liquid assets. Consider your son's treatment completely covered. Call it payment for years of friendship and professional courtesy." My heart stopped. Harrison wasn't just showing favoritism to an old college buddy. He was actively taking bribes in exchange for favorable rulings. This corruption was far more serious than simple bias. "I appreciate the help," Harrison continued. "Between you and me, your son's case seems pretty straightforward. The evidence you've presented paints a clear picture of someone who can't handle financial responsibility. I don't see any reasonable judge ruling differently." "Cooper never saw this coming," Frank chuckled. "He actually thought he could waltz in here and claim everything based on Dad's will. He has no idea how the real world works. Rich kids like him think everything should just be handed to them without consequences." I stood frozen in that bathroom stall, listening to them plan the theft of my entire inheritance. Harrison was completely compromised, and Frank had orchestrated this elaborate scheme months in advance. The private investigator, the forged documents, the excluded witnesses, everything was designed to create an airtight case built on complete lies. When I returned to the courtroom, I felt utterly powerless. Frank's attorney continued presenting evidence, while Judge Harrison nodded approvingly at each revelation. The gallery was filled with Frank's friends and associates, all shaking their heads sadly at my alleged behavior. I felt completely isolated watching this theatrical performance destroy everything my grandfather had worked to build. Dave Martinez made weak objections that Harrison consistently overruled. My court-appointed attorney was outmatched by Frank's expensive legal team and couldn't compete with their preparation and resources. Every motion was denied, every piece of evidence was excluded, and every argument was dismissed. Frank took the witness stand again to present additional testimony about my pattern of irresponsible behavior. He described incidents that never happened with such convincing detail that even I began questioning my own memories. According to Frank, I'd crashed 3 different vehicles, been arrested twice for public intoxication, and threatened family members when they refused to give me money. None of these events had ever occurred, but Frank's performance was masterful. He spoke with the pain of a disappointed father forced to confront difficult truths about his son. Judge Harrison listened with obvious sympathy, occasionally expressing concern about my alleged behavior. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly hostile toward me. Frank's planted supporters whispered among themselves about how sad it was to see a young man waste such opportunities. Several people shot disapproving glances in my direction, clearly convinced by Frank's elaborate lies. As the session neared its end, I realized this was my last chance to fight back. If Frank's plan succeeded, I would lose everything my grandfather had entrusted to me. The construction business would be sold, the rental properties would be liquidated, and William's entire legacy would be destroyed to fund Frank's gambling debts and alcohol addiction. More importantly, justice itself was being corrupted. Harrison was accepting bribes to make predetermined rulings, turning the entire legal system into a marketplace where outcomes were bought and sold, rather than decided by evidence and law. I thought about what my grandfather would do in this situation. William had faced corrupt officials and dishonest competitors throughout his construction career, but he'd always found ways to expose the truth. He'd taught me that honest work eventually defeats dishonest schemes, but only if you're willing to fight for what's right. As Frank concluded his testimony with a dramatic plea for the judge to protect my father's legacy from destruction, I made my decision. I would not let this fraud succeed without exposing every lie, every bribe, and every corrupt deal that had brought us to this moment. Frank's attorney, Marcus Webb, returned to the witness table with theatrical flair, carrying a leather briefcase, as if it contained evidence that would end the case permanently. The courtroom fell silent as Webb opened the case and withdrew a single sheet of paper encased in a protective plastic sleeve. "Your Honor," Webb announced dramatically, "I present what may be the most significant piece of evidence in this entire proceeding. This document was notarized 6 months before William Patterson's death and represents Cooper's own admission of his unfitness to handle financial responsibility." My stomach dropped as Webb handed the document to Judge Harrison. Even from my seat 20 feet away, I could see my signature at the bottom of the page, looking exactly like my natural handwriting. The notary seal appeared completely authentic with raised lettering and official stamps that would pass casual inspection. Judge Harrison examined the document with exaggerated thoroughness, holding it up to the light and studying every detail. His performance was carefully designed to appear impartial, while building suspense for Frank's supporters in the gallery. "This appears to be a voluntary relinquishment of inheritance rights," Harrison announced to the courtroom. "The document is properly notarized and contains detailed admissions from the beneficiary regarding his personal struggles with substance abuse and financial irresponsibility." Webb began reading selected portions aloud. "According to this forged document, I had voluntarily signed away my inheritance rights because I acknowledged my inability to manage large sums of money responsibly and recognized my ongoing struggles with gambling addiction and substance abuse." The document included specific admissions of drug use, multiple arrests, and violent behavior toward family members. Every word was a complete fabrication, but the document looked absolutely legitimate. Frank must have spent months practicing my signature and researching proper notarization procedures. The forger had even aged the paper slightly and used ink that matched my typical pen preferences. Dave Martinez objected weakly, arguing that such a document should have been presented during the original will reading. Judge Harrison overruled the objection, stating that new evidence can be introduced when it becomes available, particularly when it clarifies the testator's true intentions. Frank took the witness stand once more to provide context for the document. His testimony was his most convincing performance, yet describing a painful family intervention where he'd tried to help me recognize my self-destructive behavior. It was one of the hardest days of my life. Frank said, his voice breaking with practiced emotion. Cooper was so intoxicated that he could barely stand upright. He'd just lost $8,000 at a poker game and was threatening to sell his car to cover additional gambling debts. That's when I realized intervention was our only option. According to Frank's fabricated story, he'd arranged for a counselor and several family friends to confront me about my addictions. During this intervention, I supposedly became violent, throwing furniture and screaming threats at everyone present. Eventually, I'd calmed down enough to acknowledge my problems and agreed to sign the relinquishment document as the first step toward recovery. Cooper looked me in the eyes and said, "Dad, you're right. I'm destroying everything Grandpa worked for, and I can't be trusted with this responsibility." Frank testified, "It was the first honest moment we'd shared in years. I thought signing that document might be the wake-up call he needed to get serious about treatment." Frank's story included specific details that made it sound completely believable. He described the exact location of the intervention, the names of people who were supposedly present, and even quoted specific conversations that had allegedly occurred. The level of detail was impressive and terrifying. Judge Harrison listened with obvious sympathy, occasionally nodding, as Frank described his difficult decision to respect my wishes by pursuing the inheritance case. According to Frank, he was simply honoring my own admission that I couldn't handle financial responsibility. Dave Martinez cross-examined Frank briefly, but our questions were ineffective against such a detailed fictional narrative. Frank had prepared answers for every possible challenge, and his responses sounded reasonable to anyone who didn't know the truth. During another recess, I confronted Dave about our strategy. "This document is completely fake," I insisted. "I never signed anything like this. I've never had a gambling problem, never been to an intervention, never been arrested for anything." Dave looked exhausted and defeated. "Cooper, I believe you, but proving document forgery requires expert analysis that takes weeks or months. We don't have that kind of time. Even if we could prove the signature was forged, Frank could argue that you were so intoxicated you don't remember signing it." The hopelessness of my situation began sinking in. Frank had created an elaborate web of lies supported by forged documents, paid witnesses, and a corrupt judge. Every piece of evidence was carefully designed to support his narrative, while making my protests seem like desperate denials from someone with addiction issues. As the afternoon session continued, Frank's supporters in the gallery became increasingly confident. Several people smiled and whispered among themselves, clearly convinced that justice was being served by preventing a troubled young man from wasting his grandfather's hard-earned wealth. Frank's attorney began preparing closing arguments, organizing his documents, with the confidence of someone who knew the outcome was predetermined. Webb smiled at Frank and Judge Harrison, silently celebrating their expected victory. I sat in my chair feeling completely powerless, watching everything my grandfather had worked for being stolen through an elaborate fraud. The construction business that William had spent 50 years building would be liquidated. The rental properties that provided housing for dozens of families would be sold to the highest bidder. The foundation money that William had wanted to use for community projects would disappear into Frank's gambling debts. More than the financial loss, I was devastated by the corruption of justice itself. Judge Harrison was openly accepting bribes while pretending to uphold legal standards. Frank was committing multiple felonies while portraying himself as a concerned father. The entire system was rigged against truth and fairness. The weight of failure pressed down on me as I realized this might be my last opportunity to fight back. If I didn't find a way to expose Frank's lies immediately, everything would be lost forever. My grandfather had trusted me to protect his legacy, and I was about to let him down completely. But as I sat there feeling defeated, I remembered something William had told me during our last conversation. He'd been in the hospital weak from pneumonia, but still sharp mentally. "Cooper," he'd said, "dishonest people always make mistakes because they have to remember too many lies. Patient observers can always find the cracks in elaborate deceptions. William had taught me to think strategically, to prepare for problems before they occurred, and to always have backup plans. As Frank's attorney continued building his fraudulent case, I began thinking about what my grandfather would do in this situation. That's when I remembered the small recording device in my jacket pocket and realized that Frank's biggest mistake was underestimating his opponent. While he'd been busy creating false evidence, I'd been quietly gathering real evidence of his corruption. The truth was about to emerge in ways that Frank never anticipated. I stood up slowly from my chair, feeling every eye in the courtroom focus on me. Judge Harrison looked annoyed by the interruption, clearly eager to move toward his predetermined conclusion. "Your Honor," I said, keeping my voice calm and respectful, "I request permission to present additional evidence that directly contradicts the testimony we've heard today." Harrison frowned, glancing briefly at Frank before responding. "Mr. Cooper, you've already had ample opportunity to present your case. This court doesn't appreciate dramatic interruptions during closing arguments. Sir, this evidence only became available recently, and it directly proves that multiple felonies have been committed in this courtroom," I replied firmly. "I believe the court has a duty to examine evidence of fraud and perjury regardless of timing." The word felonies caused a stir throughout the gallery. Frank's confident expression faltered slightly as he exchanged worried glances with his attorney. Judge Harrison realized he couldn't refuse to examine evidence of criminal activity without appearing obviously corrupt. "Very well," Harrison said reluctantly. "You may present your evidence, but this court will not tolerate any fishing expeditions or dramatic theatrics." I pulled out my smartphone and connected it to the courtroom's audio system with help from the court technician. The device had been recording continuously for the past 3 weeks, capturing conversations that Frank thought were private. "Your Honor, this recording was made during a meeting between my father and the private investigator he hired to manufacture evidence against me. The conversation took place at Romano's restaurant on Maple Street 3 weeks ago." I pressed play, and Frank's voice filled the courtroom with crystal clarity. "Tony, I need you to understand something," Frank's recorded voice said. "I don't care if you have to Photoshop pictures or pay people to lie. That money should be mine. My father always favored Cooper over his own son, but blood should count for something." The voice of Tony Russo, private investigator, responded clearly. "Mr. Patterson, what you're asking for crosses some serious legal lines. Creating false evidence and perjured testimony could result in felony charges for both of us." Frank's laugh was audible and chilling. "Tony, I'm talking about $2 million here. We can afford to pay whatever it costs to make this case airtight. Find me witnesses who'll swear Cooper threatened them. Create receipts showing he spent money on drugs and gambling. Make him look like the spoiled brat he really is." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Frank's face went completely white as he realized the implications of what everyone was hearing. His carefully constructed facade crumbled in real time as his own words convicted him of conspiracy and fraud. The recording continued with devastating precision. "I've already got a judge who owes me favors," Frank's voice said. "Harrison and I go way back to college, and he's got financial problems I can help solve. Between his rulings and your evidence, Cooper won't know what hit him." "You're talking about bribing a federal judge," Tony's voice replied nervously. "That's a 20-year felony, Mr. Patterson. I can't be involved in anything like that." "Relax, Tony. It's not bribery when it's between old friends helping each other out. I'll handle Harrison my way. You just focus on creating evidence that proves Cooper is incompetent. By the time we're finished, everyone will see that he doesn't deserve a penny of my father's money." Judge Harrison began banging his gavel, frantically trying to regain control of the chaotic courtroom. Frank's supporters looked stunned and betrayed as they realized they'd been supporting an elaborate criminal conspiracy. Frank's attorney, Marcus Webb, jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, I demand to know how this recording was obtained. If it was gathered illegally, it must be excluded from evidence immediately." I stepped forward with confidence I hadn't felt in months. "Your Honor, this recording was made in a public restaurant using a standard smartphone. My private investigator was seated at the next table with my full authorization to document any criminal activity. No laws were broken in obtaining this evidence. The revelation that I had my own private investigator clearly shocked Frank. While he'd been busy creating false evidence, I'd been quietly gathering real evidence of his conspiracy. My grandfather's lessons about preparation and strategic thinking had finally paid off. Dave Martinez found his voice for the first time during the entire trial. Your Honor, this recording provides clear evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, and judicial bribery. Every piece of evidence presented by the plaintiff must now be considered suspect. Judge Harrison looked desperately uncomfortable, realizing that his corruption was now documented evidence in a court proceeding. The recording proved that he'd been taking bribes in exchange for predetermined rulings, destroying his career and exposing him to serious federal charges. I pressed play again, revealing additional conversations that Frank thought were private. The beauty of this plan, Frank's recorded voice continued, is that Cooper will never see it coming. He actually thinks the legal system is fair and honest. He has no idea that outcomes can be purchased if you know the right people. Tony's voice expressed continued concern. What if he has his own attorneys investigate the evidence? Professional document analysis could expose the forgeries pretty easily. Frank laughed dismissively. I've already taken care of that problem. I contacted every major law firm in the city and convinced them that Cooper is dangerous and unstable. By the time they refused his case, his reputation was already destroyed. He's stuck with whatever public defender they assign him. The calculated cruelty of Frank's plan became clear to everyone in the courtroom. He hadn't just forged evidence, he'd systematically destroyed my ability to defend myself by sabotaging my access to competent legal representation. Court officers began moving toward Frank as the implications of the recording became obvious. Multiple felonies had been committed, and the evidence was now part of the official court record. Frank started sweating profusely, whispering urgently with his attorney about damage control. Other gallery members began standing up and leaving clearly uncomfortable with being associated with criminal activity. The people Frank had paid to attend as concerned community members realized they might be called as witnesses in a federal investigation. I felt my first moment of genuine hope since this nightmare began. Frank's elaborate deception was finally crumbling under the weight of his own recorded confessions. The truth was emerging exactly as my grandfather had predicted. Patience and preparation were defeating lies and corruption. But I knew Frank and Harrison would attempt one final desperate move to salvage their conspiracy. Cornered criminals often become most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a manila folder containing bank records, legal documents, and financial statements that I'd spent weeks gathering. Frank watched nervously as I approached the evidence table, clearly wondering what additional surprises I had prepared. Your Honor, the previous recording mentioned Judge Harrison's financial difficulties and my father's offer to help solve them. I now present documentary evidence proving that illegal payments have already been made between these parties. I handed the bank statements to the court clerk, who distributed copies to Judge Harrison, Frank's attorney, and Dave Martinez. Harrison's face went ashen as he recognized his wife's business account statements, showing deposits that corresponded exactly with cases he'd ruled on. These records show payments totaling $67,000 from Frank Patterson to Harrison Financial Consulting, which is owned and operated by Judge Harrison's wife, Margaret. I explained to the courtroom, the payments correspond directly with 3 separate cases where Judge Harrison ruled in Frank Patterson's favor despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The first case involved a business dispute where Frank's construction company had used substandard materials that caused structural damage to a shopping center. Despite engineering reports proving the defects, Harrison had dismissed the lawsuit and awarded Frank's company additional contracts. The second case involved an environmental violation where Frank's company had illegally dumped construction waste in protected wetlands. State environmental officials had documented the violations with photographs and soil samples, but Harrison ruled that the evidence was inconclusive cinque concendres inconclusive and dismissed all charges. The third case involved workplace safety violations that resulted in serious injuries to two construction workers. OSHA had cited Frank's company for multiple safety violations, but Harrison reduced the fines to nominal amounts and sealed the court records to prevent public disclosure. In each case, I continued, Judge Harrison's rulings directly contradicted established facts and legal precedent. Within 30 days of each favorable ruling, Frank Patterson made substantial payments to Margaret Harrison's consulting business for alleged legal advisory services. I produced copies of the consulting contracts, which were obviously fraudulent. Margaret Harrison's company provided tax preparation services for small businesses, not legal advice for construction companies. The contracts were clearly designed to disguise bribe payments as legitimate business expenses. Frank's attorney attempted to object, but his arguments fell apart under scrutiny. Your Honor, these financial transactions represent legitimate business relationships between consenting adults. There's no evidence of any quid pro quo arrangements. I smiled confidently. Actually, there is direct evidence of quid pro quo arrangements. I produced another recording from my phone, this one capturing a conversation between Frank and Judge Harrison from 2 weeks ago. Harrison: I need you to understand how important this inheritance case is to me. Frank's voice said clearly. If Cooper gets that money, I'll never be able to pay you back for all your help over the years. Judge Harrison's recorded voice was equally clear. Don't worry about it, Frank. This case looks straightforward based on the evidence you've shown me. I don't see any reasonable judge ruling in Cooper's favor. I appreciate your friendship more than you know, Frank replied. Once this is settled, I'll have enough liquid assets to cover your son's medical expenses and help Margaret expand her business. Consider it payment for years of loyal service. The courtroom fell completely silent as Harrison's corruption became undeniable. His own voice, Isnoabuesen, was documented agreeing to predetermined case outcomes in exchange for personal financial benefits. Every principle of judicial ethics had been violated in pursuit of illegal bribes. Court officers began moving closer to both Frank and Judge Harrison. Federal judges accepting bribes faced mandatory minimum sentences under RICO statutes, and the evidence was now overwhelming and irrefutable. I continued presenting evidence with methodical precision. Your Honor, I also have phone records showing extensive communication between Frank Patterson and Judge Harrison during active litigation periods when such contact is explicitly prohibited by judicial ethics rules. The phone records revealed hundreds of calls and text messages between Frank and Harrison over the past 2 years. Many calls occurred late at night or during weekend hours, suggesting personal rather than professional relationships. Several text messages contain specific references to pending cases and desired outcomes. One particularly damaging text from Harrison to Frank read, "Don't worry about the OSHA case. I'll make sure the fines are reduced to something manageable. Your payment schedule works perfectly for Margaret's business expansion." Frank's carefully constructed image as a concerned father was completely destroyed. The evidence proved he was a career criminal who had been systematically corrupting the legal system for personal gain. His attack on my character was just the latest in a series of fraudulent schemes designed to steal money through judicial corruption. I produced photographs showing Frank and Judge Harrison meeting at expensive restaurants, attending sporting events together, and even vacationing at the same resort in Florida. The images proved their relationship extended far beyond professional courtesy into clear personal friendship that created conflicts of interest. These photographs were taken by my private investigator over the past 3 months, I explained. They document regular social contact between a sitting judge and a litigant with multiple active cases in his courtroom. Harrison realized his career was ending in real time. Every case he'd ruled on for the past 5 years would now be subject to federal investigation. Appeals courts would overturn his decisions, and hundreds of defendants he'd convicted might have grounds for new trials. The gallery erupted in chaos as spectators realized they were witnessing a major corruption scandal unfold. Court reporters worked frantically to document every revelation. Several observers pulled out phones to record the historic collapse of judicial integrity. Frank began hyperventilating as the full scope of his legal jeopardy became clear. Conspiracy, fraud, perjury, judicial bribery, and racketeering charges could result in decades of federal prison time. His desperate attempt to steal my inheritance had exposed years of criminal activity. Frank's attorney began distancing himself from his client, clearly recognizing that association with such obvious criminal activity could destroy his own career. Webb gathered his documents and whispered urgently with court officials about potential immunity deals in exchange for cooperation. I felt a surge of satisfaction watching justice finally emerge from Frank's web of corruption. My grandfather had always taught me that truth eventually defeats lies, but only if you're patient enough to gather proper evidence and strategic enough to present it effectively. But Frank wasn't finished fighting. Desperate criminals often resort to extreme measures when their carefully planned schemes collapse around them. I took a deep breath and prepared to present the most devastating evidence of all. Frank had committed crimes beyond simple fraud and bribery. He'd attempted something far more sinister that would shock everyone in the courtroom. Your Honor, the evidence I've presented so far proves extensive financial fraud and judicial corruption. However, there's an additional crime that's far more serious than anything we've discussed. I paused, letting the tension build throughout the gallery. I have evidence suggesting that Frank Patterson attempted to murder my grandfather through systematic poisoning. The courtroom exploded in gasps and shocked murmurs. Frank leaped to his feet, screaming, "That's absolutely ridiculous. You can't prove any such thing." Judge Harrison began banging his gavel frantically, but the chaos continued as spectators realized they might be witnessing evidence of attempted murder. Frank's attorney looked completely stunned, clearly having no knowledge of such serious allegations. I remained calm as I presented medical records from Riverside General Hospital. William Patterson was admitted to the hospital 4 times during his final 6 months of life. Each admission was for symptoms consistent with mercury poisoning, neurological problems, kidney dysfunction, and respiratory distress. Dr. Sarah Mitchell Williams, primary physician, had documented her concerns about the unusual pattern of his illness. Healthy 78-year-old men don't typically experience such rapid deterioration without underlying causes. Dr. Mitchell had ordered extensive testing, but William had died before comprehensive analysis could be completed. I hired an independent forensic toxicologist to review my grandfather's medical records. I continued. Dr. Robert Stevens concluded that William's symptoms were completely consistent with chronic mercury exposure, administered in small doses over several months. I produced purchasing records showing that Frank had bought industrial mercury through his construction company contacts. Mercury was sometimes used in specialized concrete applications, but Frank's company had no contracts requiring such materials during the relevant time period. These invoices show Frank Patterson purchased 12 ounces of liquid mercury from Industrial Chemical Supply Company over a 6-month period, I explained. The company confirmed that Frank personally picked up each order rather than having it delivered to job sites. I also presented pharmacy records showing that Frank had picked up William's prescription medications on multiple occasions during his grandfather's illness. Frank had volunteered to help with medical appointments and medication management, positioning himself as a caring son while gaining access to William's daily pills. Hospital security cameras captured Frank adding unknown substances to my grandfather's pill containers during 3 separate visits. I revealed producing still images from surveillance footage. The hospital saved these images because nurses found Frank's behavior suspicious. The images clearly showed Frank opening pill bottles and adding white powder while William was sleeping. Frank had been careful to avoid direct observation by medical staff, but he hadn't considered security cameras positioned throughout patient rooms. Frank completely lost control at this point, screaming at the top of his lungs. This is complete lies. Cooper is making up desperate stories because he knows he's going to lose. My father was old and sick. That's why he died. But I had one final piece of evidence that would destroy Frank's denials completely. Your Honor, I present a letter written by William Patterson just 2 weeks before his death. He gave this letter to his attorney, Mrs. Patterson, with instructions to open it only if suspicious circumstances arose regarding his illness. Mrs. Patterson entered the courtroom carrying a sealed envelope that she handed to Judge Harrison. Despite his corruption, Harrison had no choice but to open evidence that might relate to a murder investigation. Harrison read the letter silently, his face growing pale, as he absorbed William's words. The letter documented William's growing suspicions about his illness and Frank's unusual behavior during hospital visits. I'll read selected portions of this letter aloud, Harrison announced, his voice shaking. My illness has followed an unusual pattern that has concerned my doctors. I've noticed that my symptoms worsen significantly after Frank's visits, particularly when he helps with my medication management. I cannot prove anything definitively, but I suspect my son may be attempting to harm me in order to accelerate his inheritance. The letter continued with devastating detail. William had secretly begun documenting his symptoms, photographing his medications, and keeping detailed records of Frank's visits. He'd also changed his will to include specific anti-contest provisions designed to prevent Frank from challenging the inheritance through legal action. If I die under suspicious circumstances, William's letter concluded, I want investigators to examine the correlation between Frank's visits and my medical episodes. I pray that I'm wrong about my suspicions, but my grandson Cooper must be protected from any fraudulent attempts to steal his inheritance. Frank went absolutely berserk upon hearing his father's words. He lunged across the courtroom toward me, screaming, You destroyed this family that money belongs to me? I am his real son. Court officers tackled Frank before he could reach me, but his outburst continued as they restrained him. Cooper turned my father against me. I built that construction business as much as anyone. I deserved that inheritance, and I was willing to do whatever it took to claim it. Frank's breakdown included detailed confessions about his entire conspiracy. He admitted forging the relinquishment document, bribing witnesses to provide false testimony, and systematically sabotaging my access to legal representation. He also confirmed that he'd been slowly poisoning William with mercury compounds added to his daily medications. I only gave him small amounts. Frank screamed as officers dragged him toward the exit. It was supposed to look like natural deterioration from old age. He was going to die eventually anyway. I just helped speed up the process so I could claim what was rightfully mine. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Frank's complete confession echoed through the chamber. His carefully constructed facade had crumbled into desperate admissions of attempted murder, fraud, and corruption. Every crime had been motivated by greed and resentment toward his own father and son. Judge Harrison realized that his association with Frank had now implicated him in a murder conspiracy. Federal investigators would examine every case Harrison had decided, every financial transaction with Frank, and every communication between them. His career was destroyed, and he faced potential accessory charges for his role in the criminal enterprise. Court officers removed Frank from the courtroom while he continued screaming threats and confessions. His attorney abandoned him completely, recognizing that defending such obvious criminal activity would destroy his own professional reputation. The gallery remained silent as the full scope of Frank's crimes became clear. This wasn't just an inheritance dispute. It was a complex criminal conspiracy involving attempted murder, systematic fraud, and judicial corruption at the highest levels. I stood quietly as the chaos subsided, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Justice was finally emerging, but the cost had been enormous. My grandfather had died, suspecting his own son was trying to kill him. Frank had destroyed his own life through greed and resentment. The entire legal proceeding had revealed corruption that would take years to fully investigate and prosecute. But William's faith in me had been justified. I'd protected his legacy and exposed the truth exactly as he'd hoped. The two words that had started this revelation, "prove it," had led to the complete destruction of Frank's elaborate deception. 6 months after that dramatic courtroom confrontation, I sit in my grandfather's study, now legally and rightfully mine, surrounded by the warm oak furniture and family photographs that represent decades of honest work and genuine love. The leather chair where William spent countless evenings reading construction journals and planning community projects has become my favorite spot for reflection and planning. Frank is serving a sentence of 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering charges. The plea agreement saved him from a potential life sentence, but he'll spend most of his remaining healthy years behind bars. During our one prison visit, Frank finally expressed genuine remorse for his actions, acknowledging that greed and jealousy had consumed his judgment completely. Judge Harrison lost his position permanently and received an 8-year sentence for judicial corruption and conspiracy charges. Federal investigators discovered that he'd accepted bribes in 17 different cases over a 4-year period, affecting dozens of families and businesses throughout the region. The appeals court overturned every case Harrison had decided during his corrupt period, providing new hope for victims of his fraudulent rulings. Tony Russo, the private investigator Frank had hired to manufacture evidence, received immunity in exchange for his cooperation with federal prosecutors. His testimony helped convict 3 other individuals involved in similar corruption schemes throughout the state. The investigation revealed a network of corrupt officials who had been selling favorable outcomes to wealthy clients for years. I used a portion of my inheritance to establish the William Patterson Foundation for Legal Justice, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing free legal representation for families facing corruption and fraud. The foundation has grown from my initial vision into a thriving organization with 12 staff attorneys and partnerships with law schools across 3 states. Dave Martinez, my original court-appointed attorney, joined the foundation as our lead counsel after completing additional training in federal criminal law. His experience with overwhelmed public defenders helped him design programs that support overworked attorneys and ensure better representation for indigent clients. Dave's transformation from nervous public defender to confident advocate exemplifies the foundation's mission of strengthening justice through education and support. The foundation has successfully represented 43 families in cases involving corruption, fraud, and abuse of power. Our most significant victory involved exposing a county commissioner who was selling zoning variances to developers in exchange for campaign contributions. That case resulted in criminal convictions for 5 officials and policy reforms that strengthened ethical oversight throughout local government. Mrs. Patterson Williams, longtime attorney, serves on our foundation's board of directors and helps identify cases where corruption threatens family legacies and community interests. Her decades of experience guide our strategic decisions and ensure we focus resources on cases where we can achieve meaningful systemic change. The construction business that William built continues thriving under professional management, employing over 250 people and maintaining the reputation for quality work that my grandfather established. I've chosen to keep the business operating rather than selling it, honoring William's belief that good jobs strengthen entire communities. Every month I visit William's grave to update him on the foundation's progress and seek guidance for difficult decisions. These conversations help me remember that wealth is meaningless unless it's used to protect others and advance justice. My grandfather's real legacy isn't the money he left me, but the example he set for using power responsibly and standing up for truth when others choose silence. The rental properties William owned now provide affordable housing for working families, with profits supporting foundation operations. Rather than maximizing rents for personal gain, we've maintained affordable rates while upgrading properties to improve living conditions. This approach reflects William's belief that successful businesses should strengthen communities rather than exploiting them. I've also established scholarship programs at 3 local colleges, specifically supporting students from working-class families who want to pursue careers in law construction and community development. These scholarships honor William's conviction that education and opportunity should be available to anyone willing to work hard and serve others. The most meaningful aspect of this work is seeing how justice restored in one case creates hope for other victims of corruption and fraud. Families who felt powerless against wealthy opponents now have resources and support to fight back effectively. Children who watched their parents get cheated by corrupt systems now see that truth can prevail when honest people work together strategically. The courtroom experience taught me that corruption thrives in darkness, but cannot survive exposure to sustained light. Frank's elaborate deception collapsed quickly once evidence was presented systematically and publicly. Judge Harrison's career ended permanently when his financial transactions became public record. The entire conspiracy crumbled because criminals cannot maintain complex lies indefinitely when patient observers gather comprehensive evidence. My grandfather's greatest lesson was that character matters more than wealth, but wealth can amplify character in powerful ways. Frank used his resources to corrupt and deceive, ultimately destroying himself and harming everyone around him. William used his resources to build and create leaving legacies that continue strengthening communities long after his death. I've chosen to follow William's example by using my inheritance to advance justice and protect vulnerable families. The Foundation's work has connected me with attorneys, investigators, and activists throughout the country who share our commitment to fighting corruption and strengthening legal systems. These relationships have taught me that isolated incidents of fraud are often symptoms of broader systematic problems that require sustained collective effort to address effectively. Recent Foundation cases include exposing a medical fraud scheme that was overcharging elderly patients for unnecessary procedures, stopping a housing developer who was using fraudulent environmental reports to build in protected areas, and helping military families fight predatory lending practices targeting service members. Each case reinforces William's teaching that honest work eventually defeats dishonest schemes, but only when good people are willing to invest time, resources, and courage in exposing truth. The Foundation's success rate exceeds 80% because we carefully investigate each case and only pursue matters where evidence supports clear legal violations. Looking back on that terrifying courtroom confrontation, I realized that Frank's greatest mistake was underestimating both my determination and my grandfather's wisdom. Frank saw only a young man who might be easily intimidated and outmaneuvered. He failed to recognize that William had spent years teaching me to think strategically, prepare thoroughly, and never surrender when fighting for justice. The 2 words that changed everything, "prove it," reflected my grandfather's fundamental approach to life. William never accepted claims without evidence, never trusted appearances without investigation, and never surrendered to corruption without fighting back with truth. Those 2 words challenged Frank to support his lies with facts, and facts were the one thing his elaborate deception couldn't provide. Frank's downfall began the moment he chose deception over honesty and greed over family loyalty. His corruption consumed everything positive in his life, ultimately destroying his freedom, his relationships, and his legacy. The inheritance he coveted so desperately became meaningless once he lost his humanity pursuing it through criminal means. William's true gift to me wasn't the money or property he left behind. but the example he set for using resources responsibly and fighting for justice when others choose comfort. The Foundation's work continues his legacy in ways that money alone could never accomplish, protecting families and strengthening communities through legal advocacy and systemic reform. As I write this reflection, I'm preparing for tomorrow's board meeting, where we'll review applications for 3 new scholarship recipients and discuss strategy for a complex corruption case involving municipal contracts. This work brings daily satisfaction because it advances justice while honoring my grandfather's memory and values. The courtroom confrontation with Frank taught me that truth always emerges eventually, but only when honest people are willing to gather evidence, present facts, and persist through intimidation and corruption. Frank's elaborate lies collapsed quickly when confronted with comprehensive documentation of his crimes. Judge Harrison's corruption ended permanently when his financial transactions became public knowledge. The Foundation has become my life's work because it combines Williams' practical approach to problem solving with meaningful impact on families facing injustice. Every successful case proves that corruption can be defeated when victims have access to competent legal representation and adequate resources to gather evidence effectively. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose between staying silent about injustice or risking everything to fight for what's right? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your stories help inspire our ongoing work and remind us why this fight for justice matters so deeply. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to help others discover how truth can triumph over corruption when good people refuse to surrender. Subscribe to follow more stories about standing up for justice and protecting family legacies from those who would steal them through lies and manipulation. Share this story with anyone who might be facing similar challenges with corrupt systems or fraudulent schemes. Your support could be exactly what they need to find hope and fight back effectively. Together, we can create communities where honesty prevails over deception and where justice protects everyone, not just those with money and connections. Thank you for joining me on this journey from despair to justice, and may you always have the courage to speak truth when it matters most. Remember that even in our darkest moments, patience, preparation, and persistence can overcome the most elaborate deceptions when we're fighting for what's truly right.